Hello, my name is John Ford, and welcome to my Proxmox Remote Management Full Course Series. In previous videos, we've gone ahead and we've set up our pfSense firewall that will be providing our internal networks with internet access. In addition, we set up a management machine that we can use to access pfSense and perform additional configuration changes through the web user interface. In this video, we're going to talk about accessing pfSense through its web interface and what additional options you have that you can set there. We will also talk about setting up different firewall rules depending on how you plan to access pfSense and whether you will be managing it internally from this management machine versus externally from a different web server. To log into pfSense for the first time, I will enter the default web credentials of username admin with password pfSense all lowercase. That's pfSense. Then I can click sign in. I'm not going to save this password because I plan on changing it later anyway. From here, pfSense will walk us through the first time setup process. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to click Next again. From here, I'll keep the hostname as pfSense. I will leave the default domain name of home.arpa. Feel free to change this to whatever domain name you would like. Then I'll enter the primary and secondary DNS servers. I'll just enter 1.1.1.1 and 8.8.8.8. This first one is the publicly available Cloudflare DNS resolver, and the second one is the publicly available Google DNS resolver. It's always a good idea to specify these in case they aren't provided to you through DHCP. However, as you can see with this option here, these will likely be overridden with the DHCP provided DNS servers. I should also note that these DNS servers will automatically be provided through DHCP to any additional networks that are internal that we create. For example, this will be provided through DHCP to our LAN network. From here, I'll click Next. I will keep the default time server and I will change my time zone to America/Chicago because that is closest to where I am located. From there, I'll click Next. From here, we have already configured the WAN interface when in the console previously, so I do not need to change anything here. However, if there are any additional changes you would like to make, feel free to make those changes here. I will simply scroll down, accept the existing values, and click Next. From here, again, we have already configured the LAN IP address from the console, so I'll leave this at its default and click Next. From here, it asks to change the admin password. This admin password will be used to log in to the graphical user interface. Just like in previous instances, I recommend using a secure password. However, for demonstration purposes, I will use password capital P password 123 exclamation point. I will enter this password again and then click Next. From here, it says click Reload to reload pfSense with new changes. I will simply click Reload. Now I have to wait while pfSense reloads. When it's complete, it will say congratulations, pfSense is now configured. After scrolling down and clicking Finish, I am greeted with the main dashboard page of pfSense. The remaining instructions will vary depending on your network setup. You have two options. Remember that we need to install the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts, as well as configure a web interface that students will access, or users will access, to start, stop, revert, and access one instance of their environment. I will refer to this machine that has the pfSense and Proxmox scripts, as well as the web interface. I will refer to it as the web server. Your first option is to make this management machine or use this manager machine as your web server. This means you will install the Proxmox and pfSense scripts, and you will host the web interface users will access directly on this manager machine. Your second option is to use a separate dedicated server as your web server. This means that this current manager machine will only be used to configure pfSense. However, the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts, as well as the web interface, will be hosted separately on a separate web server. I will show two different configurations that you would need to set up, depending which is the case. First, I will show you what you need to do if you plan to have your web server be separate from this manager machine. If you plan to use this manager machine as your web server, which I personally recommend because that's an easier setup, you may skip ahead towards the end of this video where I will show the configuration for that case. Anyway, if you plan to have a separate web server, it will need access to pfSense via SSH. However, pfSense is only accessible via SSH on the internal LAN network. Any external server will be accessing it from the WAN, or from the external network. Therefore, we will have to create an additional firewall network address translation rule that will take any traffic coming into the firewall from the WAN and forward it back to pfSense, but through its LAN IP address. In order to do this, I'm going to go to Firewall, and I'm going to click on NAT to create a new NAT rule. What we want to do is we want to port forward SSH from our web server to the firewall's internal IP address, or the IP address that's on the NAT. I will click Add to create a new port forward rule. The source interface, where requests will be coming from, or where the web server will be located, is WAN. So I will leave the interface as WAN. I will also leave IPv4, and I will leave the protocol as TCP. Keep in mind that SSH is a subprotocol of TCP. This next step is optional but highly recommended. If you don't specify the source, then anyone from the WAN or from the internet who tries to connect to pfSense on SSH will be able to connect. However, by specifying the source, you can make it so that SSH is only accessible directly from your web server. In order to do that, I'll click Display Advanced, and from here where it says Source, I'll select Single Host or Alias, and I will put the IP address of my web server. In this case, let's say the public IP address of my web server is 108.68.134.29. However, feel free to change this to match the IP address of your web server from which you will be connecting to pfSense or SSHing into pfSense. For the source port range, we will specify SSH, which by default is port 22. The destination will be this firewall. This means that this rule will apply to any SSH requests from this IP address to this firewall. I will also specify the destination port range as SSH. Any requests will be redirected to the following address. For the address, I will specify this firewall's internal LAN IP address, which is the exact same IP address as I'm using to access the web interface. In this case, it's 192.168.1.1. This makes sure that all SSH requests are forwarded back to this firewall, but through its LAN or its internal address. For the redirect target port, we want to redirect it back to SSH, so I will once again select SSH. This next step is optional, but you may provide yourself with a description that will remind you what this rule is intended for. I would call it something like SSH from external web server. Once this looks good, you may scroll down and click Save. Then click Apply Changes for the configuration to take effect. You'll notice that we have created a new port forward that, once again, will take any SSH requests from our web server that are destined for this firewall and redirect them back to this firewall by using its internal LAN IP address. This will allow us to SSH into pfSense from this address externally. I would like to point out that there are multiple ways of making the port forward rules that I showed in this section. Specifically, there are multiple ways of specifying the pfSense firewall's address. In the examples I showed you, I switched the destination to this firewall self. But I could have just as easily used WAN address as the destination. By default, WAN address is the address of the pfSense firewall, but specifically on the WAN interface, whereas this firewall is the IP address of the firewall, but it applies to all interfaces, which is sometimes useful for floating rules. In this case, it doesn't matter which one you choose. I personally prefer to choose this firewall self because that's more intuitive for me to understand. Similarly, when I set the redirect target IP to the LAN IP address of this firewall, which is 192.168.1.1, instead of doing that, I could have simply switched single host to LAN address. By default, LAN address is the internal IP address on the LAN of this firewall, or 192.168.1.1. However, I personally prefer to see the IP address written out, which is why I directly typed it out. I just wanted to make a quick note about these things in case you are confused why I made the choices I made. It really doesn't matter. In this case, I could have chosen WAN address, and I could have chosen LAN address, and it would have meant the same thing. Now, I will demonstrate how to configure pfSense if you plan on using this same manager machine as your web server. In order to do this, you need to make this manager machine accessible from the internet. In other words, you need to make the HTTP and HTTPS ports accessible to any external machine. The way they're going to access those HTTP and HTTPS ports is through the pfSense firewall. Before we can go ahead and set up the necessary firewall rules, we need to ensure that this manager machine has an IP address that does not change. This will ensure that our firewall rules are always effective. Right now, the IP address of this manager machine is being dynamically assigned through DHCP. This means if the manager machine were to disconnect from the network and reconnect, it could be assigned a different IP address, which would render our firewall rule ineffective. In order to avoid this happening, we can use a DHCP static mapping in order to always assign our manager virtual machine with the same IP address. This means that every time it connects, it will be assigned the same IP address, and so the firewall rules that we then create will always apply. In order to do this, or assign this manager machine a static DHCP mapping, also known as a static DHCP lease, I will go to Services and DHCP Server. From here, I'll make sure that I have the LAN network selected, and I'll scroll all the way down. As you can see, here we have a DHCP static mapping section for this interface. To create a new static mapping, I will click on Add. Now, all we have to do is specify the MAC address of the interface that manager is using to access the LAN. And then we have to specify an IP address that will act as our static or unchanging IP address for the manager virtual machine. To find this virtual machine's MAC address, or the MAC address for the interface that this virtual machine is using, you can simply go to the Hardware section and look at the network device that is connected to our NAT network, or VMBR1. The address is specified right here. In my case, it's 5E492A AC0B and 18, all separated with colons. Going back to the console, I have re-entered that MAC address here, and now it's time to choose an IP address to assign this manager virtual machine. Be sure to choose an IP address that is not in the current DHCP pool. What I mean by that is be sure to choose an IP address that is not in the range of IP addresses you specified previously when serving DHCP. I, in my case, will specify an IP address of 192.168.1.5. If you remember the range I chose previously for the DHCP pool, it started at 192.168.1.10 and ended at 192.168.1.245. This IP address is still valid for this network range, but it does not fall within that range of IPs. It is not between 10 and 245. From here, I will click Save, and I will click Apply Changes to apply changes and create the static DHCP mapping. If you ever forgot what your DHCP pool range is, you can always scroll down and note where it says range. You'll notice that here my range again was from .10 to .245. If you didn't provide room in this range for any additional IP addresses, you can always go ahead and change the range here. For example, if I wanted the range to start at 1.11, I could change this to 11. However, I will keep it the same as it is right now. Be sure to remember this static IP address that you chose, because we will be entering this IP address later when creating our firewall rules. I'm going to go to Firewall and NAT to create network address translation rules. We'll need to create two rules. The first one will redirect any HTTP requests that are destined for this firewall to the internal IP address of the manager machine. The second one will do the same thing, but for HTTPS requests, redirecting any HTTPS requests intended for this firewall to the internal manager machine. Then, students can access the website that will be hosted on this manager machine simply by using the pfSense firewall's public IP address. All right, anyway, I'm going to click Add to create my first rule. We will leave the interface as WAN since we want to redirect any requests that are coming from the external WAN network. HTTP is a subprotocol of TCP, so for protocol, we will leave it as TCP. For the destination, we'll say this firewall or self. This is because we want to take any requests that are destined for this firewall and redirect them to our manager machine. For the destination port range, as mentioned previously, I will select HTTP. From here, I would like to redirect these HTTP requests to the manager machine. Here, I will enter the manager machine's internal IP address. As mentioned previously, the manager machine's internal or LAN IP address is 192.168.1.5. The redirect port will be HTTP. From here, I can enter a description optionally to remind myself of what this does. I'll just say HTTP for web interface on manager. This will remind me that this is redirecting HTTP requests to the web interface that's being hosted on this manager virtual machine. I'll click Save and Apply Changes to apply changes. I will also add an additional rule that will look exactly the same, except wherever I specified HTTP before, I will now specify HTTPS. So once again, I will leave these the same. The destination will be this firewall. The destination port range this time will be HTTPS. The redirect target IP will once again be the LAN IP of the manager machine, 192.168.1.5, and the redirect target port will be HTTPS. And again, optional, but if you'd like to remember what this is for, you can enter a description. I'm going to call this HTTPS for web interface on manager. That reminds me that this rule takes any HTTPS requests and redirects it to the web interface on this manager VM. And I'll click Save and Apply Changes to apply these changes. Now, as soon as we set up the Proxmox and pfSense remote management scripts, and we set up the web interface on this manager machine, students will be able to access that web interface through the pfSense firewall. The very last change I'll make is to disable the pfSense DNS resolver. The reason I'm going to do this is so that DNS is directly provided through those DNS resolvers that we specified when configuring pfSense. To do this, I'll go to Services, DNS Resolver, and I'll uncheck Enable DNS Resolver. Then I'll scroll down and click Save. And finally click Apply Changes. Now that these changes have been applied, any internal network, including the LAN, should automatically be provided the DNS servers that we previously, or the DNS resolvers that we previously specified when configuring the pfSense interface. If I go to Services and DHCP Server, I could additionally specify custom DNS servers here. However, as this note states, leave blank to use system default DNS servers. The IP address of this firewall interface, if the resolver forwarder is enabled, we just disabled that. Otherwise, the servers configured in the general settings or those obtained dynamically. This is what we want. Now, in order to reload these changes on my manager machine, I could either restart the network manager service or more simply reboot the machine. I will once again go to the upper right hand corner and click on Shut Down. Once the machine has finished shutting down, I will reboot it. To reboot the machine, I can click Start Now.